Welcome. My name is Colleen Lezovitz, and I am a Senior Marketing Manager at Worldwide Clinical Trials. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Alzheimer's Disease Clinical Trials, Improving Screen Failure and Recruitment Rates. Before we kick things off, I did just want to go over a few things. All attendees are on mute, but please go ahead and use the Q&A window to submit questions at any time pertaining to the presentation, because we will be reserving about 15 minutes at the end to address any questions that come in. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to access the on-demand, so most likely that email will come to you tomorrow. Our speakers today are Jeffrey Zucker, Worldwide's Vice President, Feasibility and Recruitment Optimization, Dr. Tom Babich, Worldwide's Vice President of Neuroscience, and Barbara Zupancic, Worldwide's Director, Global Patient Recruitment and Retention. At this time, I would like to hand things over to Jeff. Jeff?
Thanks much, Colleen. Thank you, everybody, for hello, and thank you for joining our webcast today. As we all know, the focus on Alzheimer's has been quite high for some years, and there's a good reason for that, because of the impact that Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's-related diseases such as MCI and things like that are really very impactful in our world. Seeking new treatments to stop the progression, deal better with the symptoms, or even prevent through vaccines are some of the leading areas of research right now in the field. So, identifying patients early on in their disease is really something key, and it's something that we're going to be talking about. I'm just going to give a brief introduction, but I'm going to let Tom and Barbara do much of the heavy lifting. But today we're really going to be talking about that, and we're also going to be talking about how to engage these patients and get them interested in doing clinical trials. Also discussing other options with them for treatment. On a personal note for myself, I did want to share that a couple weeks ago, recently, I had the pleasure of attending the CNS Summit, which hopefully many of you on the call also got to attend. It's a great summit geared specifically towards Alzheimer's. Was a session led by Jill Smith at Roche and Lisa LaLuna at ePharma Solutions. And during this specific session, we discussed Alzheimer's disease, identifying Alzheimer's disease, the issues with screen failure of Alzheimer's disease, and also treatment of Alzheimer's disease and engaging patients. How do we engage patients? And how do we engage, primary care physicians as well to be able to identify early enough? And I hope and I believe that when we start going through some of these presentations that Tom has in identifying Alzheimer's disease early on in its progression, the earlier on the better for us. And we're conducting a lot of trials right now in specifically prodromal Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. So we want to be able to get these patients engaged and offer them options as soon as possible. And then Barbara is really going to lead a discussion or talk a little bit about how do we really engage these patients after we do identify them. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the important people and introduce Dr. Tom Babich, who's going to talk a little bit further about how we're identifying these patients. Tom? Tom, are you there?
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of us who come today for this talk. I'm going to share my impressions regarding early Alzheimer's disease and challenges in drug development with people with early memory impairment and Alzheimer's disease. After more than 100 years, when we were aware of Alzheimer's disease, there is a concept of early Alzheimer's disease as the most important part of the assessment of people and early detection of healthy people with a memory impairment. So here you can see practically well-known picture of normal aging and decline of cognitive functioning through the time, where at the beginning we are faced with a subjective cognitive impairment, which is following in some patients to objective cognitive impairment or later to so-called MCI condition. And finally, some of these patients will be identified later on as Alzheimer's disease. So the main question at the moment is, who are these patients who are suffering from early memory impairment who will develop Alzheimer's disease? You know that this early memory impairment was well known as a late life forgetfulness, age-consistent memory impairment. But today, the new concept is basically taking all of these patients among people with Alzheimer's disease, because we know exactly that Alzheimer's disease is starting much earlier than we are aware or able to identify these patients in every clinical practice. There are some interesting studies published in 2008 where we can identify some changes on neuropsychological tests in healthy people who will later develop Alzheimer's disease. So you can see here that basically some tests like Isaac tests or Wechsler similarity tests are distinguishing patients, healthy volunteers, among people who will develop Alzheimer's disease later on. So practically 10 years earlier, before of diagnosis, we basically have some instruments to identify these patients. However, these patients have no spontaneous memory impairment, and that's why they are not coming to see their physicians very often. However, due to this early recognition of some symptoms and signs, my good friend and colleague, Professor Bogdanovich, coined interesting term for this drug strategy development, which was shift to the left in Alzheimer's disease, which means that we need to start to identify high-risk people, high-risk healthy volunteers who are suffering from biomarkers burden characteristic for Alzheimer's disease much earlier than disease is present in everyday clinical practice. So you can see here that practically some of these people have already in preclinical phase amyloid burden. They have a tau-mediated neural injury, and of course their cognition is going to be slightly affected. But the main question at this time is how we can make a diagnosis, how much these changes, including mild memory impairment, are important and sensitive for diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So the key issue in this stage is how we can recognize further Alzheimer's disease patients among people who are suffering from pseudodementia in depression or similar, and that's why we need to pay more attention on objective cognitive impairment, because subjective cognitive impairment, you will see in the next slide, is usually very difficult to interpret, because usually people and their caregiver are observing some changes. But if you see this very interesting work for Fratiglioni in 2003, you can see that practically only 25 to 26% of people where caregiver and patient are reporting subjective memory impairment. Only in 35% of them this should be confirmed by objective tests. That's why we need to pay much more attention on proper diagnosis of patients with early cognitive impairment and also Alzheimer's disease. This is the classical slide of diagnosis of early Alzheimer's disease, where basically symptoms of memory and cognitive decline should be reviewed by a physician after interview with the patient and his family, and after physical examination and brief cognitive tests, excluding also some conditions which are not typical for Alzheimer's disease, like sudden onset of memory impairment, presence of focal neurological signs, and similar. These should be excluded, and basically we have a clinical impression of a patient with a potential Alzheimer's disease. However, some tests are mandatory to confirm or rule out other causes of dementia, and here in red you can see only tests which we are using in a clinical research, whereas in green we are using some tests which are common in everyday practice. So basically, the key issue in all clinical trials is how to translate physicians' own impression of diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease with a well-established criteria for clinical research, like NINCDS criteria, DSM criteria, International Working Group criteria, or National Institute of Aging criteria of Alzheimer's disease. Regardless of which criteria we will be using in particular clinical trial, there is something which all of these criteria have in common. They have in common mandatory presence of the progressivity of memory or cognitive decline, which should be, according to McCann, objective, not only subjective. Unfortunately, many of clinical trials, particularly all clinical trials, neglected this condition, although this is part of criteria, but very often people in clinical practice are neglecting progressivity of memory decline, which means that if I see a patient first time in my practice today, this patient cannot be eligible for clinical trial regardless of all other criteria satisfied, because I cannot prove progressivity of memory decline if I do not have a record of such an event before. However, using biomarkers in clinical diagnosis of patients with Alzheimer's disease, particularly biomarkers of amyloid burden and neurodegeneration, we have more help in a correct diagnosis. But on the other side, we have to be careful that there are cognitively normal people who have amyloid burden markers in CSF or confirmed by PET scan. So in fact, without clinically present progressive memory impairment and progressive memory decline, we cannot be certain that our patients can have Alzheimer's disease, even if they have positive markers either in CSF or at a PET scan. That's why we basically are using some common inclusion criteria for the inclusion patients in clinical trials when we are doing MSA clinical trials, all patients, or if we are doing clinical trial with mild Alzheimer's disease patients. So you can see here, in the classical MCI conditions, we use Peterson criteria, which are criteria only clinical and neuropsychological criteria with no mandatory biomarker positivity needed. However, recently developed International Working Group criteria and NI criteria for diagnosis of MSI, mandatory requesting presence of biomarkers pathology either in a CSF or in a PET scan. And also, for these patients, we need to prove that these patients are suffering from episodic memory impairment. The most often instrument which will help us to detect these patients are free and acute selective reminding test, widely used in several clinical trials. Using this test, we have opportunity to make distinction between MCI patients and patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. However, the main problem for investigator and physicians is how to recruit people with mild cognitive impairment, with a mild memory impairment, because majority of them are not reporting this spontaneously, and if some of them are reporting spontaneously, these tests are quite long, takes a long time, and unfortunately experienced physicians, particularly physicians who are dealing with these patients, have no sufficient time at the initial screening. That's why we investigated some other potential instruments, particularly for GPs and also people who are in the community who might screen these patients much earlier than we in a clinical practice who who are basically managing patients with Alzheimer's disease. That's why prodromal clinical trials are very, very difficult to be performed, because it's very difficult to have a patient in a clinical studies who will have a progressivity of memory decline confirmed by objective tests, and also who will at the same time have a positive biomarkers. There are only 2 clinical trials so far done in exclusively prodromal Alzheimer's disease in a phase 2 and 3. You can see here these two studies with the clinical entry criteria, biomarker entry criteria, and primary outcome measures. Unfortunately, these 2 clinical trials failed, but what was more important to point out here in this talk is you can see that screen failure rate in these 2 clinical trials were between 76 and 80% patients, which is unusually high. We who are dealing with patients with Alzheimer's disease so many years and with such experience in clinical research, we are basically comfort with a screen failure rate between 35 and 40% maximum, but here a double figure is definitely something that we need to change, and we need to make some efforts to improve that. How we can do that? Well, let's go a little bit back and let's try to understand 3 different subgroup of patients who are the most interesting for us in clinical research of Alzheimer's disease. So there are so-called preclinical people, prodromal people, and patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. So you can see here that there are some of them in asymptomatic phase, some of them would be in preclinical phase, and some of them will be in clinical phase. What they have in common? They have in common progressivity or cognitive impairment, which is very often not such a prominent that should be seen in everyday clinical practice. What they also have in common, they have some biomarkers in the CSF, usually A-beta-42 or A-beta-40 proteins. Their level is going to be reduced in people with Alzheimer's disease, but at the same time, there is the accumulation of soluble tau in the CSF, and together with the phosphorylated tau, we have very important biomarkers for clinical diagnosis of patients with Alzheimer's disease. At the moment, it seems that ratio between A-beta-42 and phosphorylated tau 181 is one of the best diagnostic biomarker sign, much better than each of these parameters itself. A few years ago, when we performed clinical trials in MCI patients, the inclusion criteria was usually Peterson criteria, and the primary endpoint was the percentage of people who will be converted in Alzheimer's disease. Whereas today, when we are using these biomarkers as additional help in diagnosis of patients with Alzheimer's disease, we changed terminology a little bit, and now we are talking about presymptomatic dementia or prodromal Alzheimer's disease or MCI due to Alzheimer's disease. There are really mild, clinically unimportant differences between all of these criteria. That's why we can easily say that these people are basically people with a CDR of 0.5 with some minimal cognitive impairment, but no activities of daily living affected, which is the main difference between these group and patients with a mild Alzheimer's disease. The second group which we are interested in are people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, which are usually subset of patients in development of new products in Alzheimer's disease. However, having history of prodromal Alzheimer's disease itself in the clinical trials with such a high screen failure rate, all of clinical trials which are ongoing now are combining in inclusion criteria people with MCI and people with mild Alzheimer's disease, but also adding some biomarkers as a potential diagnostic tools to help in a diagnostic procedure. Finally, there is a preclinical group of Alzheimer's disease. These are people with only positive biomarkers, with a minimal or no cognitive impairment, and in fact only people who might have some genetic or historical facts or epidemiological data that these people might be exposed to high risk of Alzheimer's disease would be eligible for such a type of clinical trials. I'm aware of few clinical trials ongoing among these patients. However, what is important to point out, particularly for the second group of patients, for the prodromal and the pre-dementia patients, how we can recognize, how we can extract these people from everyday clinical practice, how we can make sure that patient who has a subjective memory impairment should be easily detected, and how this patient would be proceeded later on. One of the interesting tests for this is a brief abbreviated mini-mental scale, which you can see here, which is consisting of 4 items instead of more in mini-mental, where basically first step will be registration from mini-mental, and the next step will be orientation in time. The third step will be calculation from a mini-mental or clock driving test, and finally will be a recall. So these red tests, so a registration of mini-mental or calculation or clock driving test will not be calculated. Only orientation and recall will be calculated as a potential score. So the maximum score is 8. Score of 6 or below definitely request further action. So this test was investigated firstly in this paper in 2009, and the conclusion of this paper is that summation of 2 subscores, orientation on time and 3-word recall task, well correlated with free and cued selective test, and also it's more strongly associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease than a few recall score or mini-mental. Interestingly, when you are using such approach, practically you can identify more patients from population who basically are not able of their cognitive impairment. However, this should not be sufficient for the diagnosis of dementia, because these patients should be reassessed at least 6 months later to see if there is a progressivity of dementia. So under normal circumstances, the strategy will be, after this brief test, one more sophisticated and more sensitive test should be performed, which could probably identify the problem, and another test after 3 to 4 months will be inevitable to confirm progressivity of cognitive impairment. So what are basically causes of screening failures in clinical trials with Alzheimer's disease? So you can see that 5 to 10% of all screening failures are belonging to the group of symptoms of memory or cognitive decline, interview with patient, physical examination, and also exclusion of clinical diagnosis. The second group of screening failures are belonging to brief cognitive tests, neuropsychological investigation, routine CT or MRI, and finally blood tests. The third group of about 15 to 25% of screening failures are belonging to the specific safety MRI, which we introduced after introducing of a specific vaccine against amyloid. So this is amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. which we've seen in some studies with anti-amyloid groups. So because this should be seen only with specific MRI sequences, I extracted this group as a separate cause of screen failures. And at the beginning, the screen failure of such a type was about 30 to 35%, but now, because many of patients are repeating clinical trials, we've seen that this group is between 15 and 25%, and this is mandatory safety instrument which should be done in all clinical trials targeting amyloid as a passive or active vaccine. Finally, there is a group of highly sophisticated tests in patients with Alzheimer's disease, which are including CSF examination, amyloid PET, volumetric MRI, FDG PET, and more recently, tau PET. So this group is responsible for about 30% of patients. So in fact, if you can see this from left to the right, I basically grouped the most common, the cheapest examinations on the left-hand side, and the most difficult and the most expensive examination on the right-hand side. So overall, if you calculate number of screen failures in clinical trials with Alzheimer's disease, having this figure, we can calculate that about 50 to 60% of initially screened patients would finally be identified as a screen failures. That's why it's extremely important at the beginning to include patients with progressive cognitive decline, because patients with progressive cognitive decline have a more chance to have a positive biomarkers, and they will be definitely people who will not be considered as a dropout patients. That's why what we are suggesting in our clinical trials is basically a proactive approach to potential people who will take part in clinical trials with Alzheimer's disease. So before consent, there are several predictable causes of potential screen failures. I know GCP says there is no action before consent for particular clinical trial, but if you are a leader in a memory research center, you basically qualified your patients and you are examining your patients every so often. So basically we can stratify our patients according to their medical history, medical status, dementia history and diagnosis, concomitant medication, mini-mental, full mini-mental, or Mantra cognitive assessment test, which is also useful test for MCA patients. We can consider study benefits, study complexity, so everything, and also we can talk about patients' expectation with their caregiver and patients. So finally, we can probably identify some patients who will definitely not be eligible for the trial after consent. So this pre-consent work is extremely important to reduce potential screen failures, which will definitely come inevitably after consent. Unfortunately, only few but highly sophisticated sites in Europe are doing this way, and usually their screen failure rate is much lower than in average clinical studies. There are also, after consent, there are unfortunately some group of non-predictable reasons for screen failures, like structural MRI, if we haven't done this before, functional MRI, diagnostic laboratory, PET scan, or CSF sampling. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is no way how to reduce screen failures from this group. But on the semi-predictable group, we can probably find some cognition tests, depression tests, patient's wish, and caregiver wish. So if we have enough time before consent to talk to patients and show them and explain all of the aspects of clinical trials, all benefits, all risks, so practically screen failures rate from the withdrawal of the consent should be less than 10% in patients with Alzheimer's disease where we are targeting cognition. Maybe in patients where we are targeting behavioral changes, this figure might be higher. After randomization, it's important to keep patients in a study. So well-designed protocol will definitely be helpful when dosing frequency is pretty low, when we have obvious benefit of the treatment in terms of patient symptoms. labor intensity and length of studies are extremely important because examination burden is going to be more and more important in clinical trials of Alzheimer's disease because of the regulatory requests. Practically every examination of patients, every follow-up examination of patients with Alzheimer's disease should take 2 to 3 hours, which is quite long, and some of patients are not happy to stay in a clinic. Semi-predictable reasons could be adverse events of investigational products or new medication needed, and of course non-predictable reasons for screen failures should be also adverse events of placebo or some paramedical reasons. What WCT is doing to reduce screen failures rate? We are introduced Centralized Eligibility Review System, which is reviewing relevant medical history, dementia history, particularly course of disease and evidence of cognitive decline, and also documents about that. We are carefully reviewing current medical status, including some cognitive tests, current therapy documents which are including neuroimaging and laboratory tests, and we are making decision of eligibility within 24 hours for our patients in clinical trial. Here, I would probably stop my talk with the conclusion that all what I practically elaborated here you can find in a recently published article done by my colleague Hank Reardon and myself in a Journal of Clinical Studies, where we made a lot of effort to reduce our screen failure group rate, and at the moment in a study that we are going to, which we are managing in prodromal Alzheimer's disease patients. Among prodromal Alzheimer's disease patients, our screen failure rate is about 50%, which is definitely much lower than was in previous clinical trial. I would stop here and hand over to Barbara for our Global Director of the Recruitment and Retention to say about our recruitment and retention strategy.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was fascinating. I'm going to start broad and go granular. The latest numbers show that around 35.6 million people worldwide have some form of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is obviously the most common form of dementia, and it accounts for 50 to 75% of all cases. Clinically, Alzheimer's disease is very well understood, but this devastating progressive neurological disorder is characterized by cognitive impairment, psychiatric symptoms, behavioral disturbances, and ultimately impairment of daily activities. Alzheimer's disease can have, as my colleague just mentioned, a long prodromal phase. So signs of cognitive decline can appear as long as 12 years before the onset of dementia. And so this is termed prodromal Alzheimer's, or mild cognitive impairment. And as Tom distinguished it, the earlier phase is called MCI, or prodromal phase, as opposed to mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease. So our goal in clinical research programs is to identify patients as early as possible in the hope of influencing the course of this devastating disease. So it's challenging to identify subjects for inclusion in these trials, oftentimes, because the symptoms are prevalent in the community, but patients don't self-identify these conditions. In clinical trials, obviously, which is what we do, we're acutely aware that understanding not only the disease clinically, but the patient and his or her life, what they go through on a day-to-day basis, is essential. I've been studying Alzheimer's disease for a number of years, and I've been collecting all kinds of information. And I'll start with something personal. My dad has passed away from Alzheimer's disease. And when he was first diagnosed, he was doing okay. He was independent. He was able to do puzzles. He was able to talk with friends, walk the dog. And if you didn't really pay attention, when you were speaking with him, you wouldn't really even know that anything was going on. But I did ask him once, I said, Dad, what's your life like? And he said, it's like living a dream. And I said, what do you mean by that, living a dream? And he couldn't explain it. So I guess the implication here is that patients with mild cognitive impairment may actually be more cognitively compromised than expected. They may have problems either understanding what's been asked or providing relevant explanations. So in clinical research, we also look closely at what are some barriers to participation. And for Alzheimer's specifically, and this can, be divided up between the phases, but overall, we have to take into consideration such things as what is the transit time to the clinic? How far is it? How difficult is it going to be? Constant caregiver participation. I mean, that is huge. They're exhausted, and that many times, we work, so it's hard to take time off to go to clinic visits. Scheduling difficulties at the site, so there needs to be flexibility and what time of the day the assessments are done. During the screening process, avoiding bad first impressions. The engagement process must largely be solidified during the first few clinic visits. And if it's not, there's no time to ramp up that later on. Noisy and crowded offices are very difficult for these folks. Tedious visits with multiple involved procedures are difficult. And obviously experimental manipulations perceived by the patient as painful. And that can include neuroimaging, the confinement in the machine, CSF sampling, all of those things that we need to consider at the sites. So both caregivers and patients really, reported difficulty with long doctor's visits. They become quick to be frustrated. They become irritable when they're asked to complete tasks. They can't sit very long, and they appear more sensitive to sensory inputs, needle sticks, loud sounds, lights. And obviously, as I mentioned, the case of my own father, occasionally unable to understand compound sentences, abstract concepts without help. So these are some of the things that we need to be aware of. And here, really, I kind of distinguish between the two sides of the slide here. One is MCI patients or prodromal, and the other I would term mild to moderate Alzheimer's patients. And here you can see some of the differences. Obviously, with the milder folks, the patients are much more involved. As the disease progresses, obviously, caregivers take a bigger and bigger role. Mild cognitive impaired patients are able to speak insightfully and, can still be articulate, but they do display cognitive and behavioral deficits. Because mild cognitive impairment, they know that the decline is coming. So the focus is on, comfort, quality of life, keeping it normal as much as possible. And caregivers then become more critical to driving action, from getting the folks diagnosed to making medical decisions for them. And the two driving forces behind caregivers' decisions for patients are their and the patient's comfort and how manageable the patient will be in a situation. I know with my mother it was always an issue. Should we take my dad in? Is he too agitated today? And caregivers often feel that they don't count. They're so busy caring for folks that are sicker that, they're willing to stick with a clinical trial that makes them feel known and supported. So that we must not forget when we're talking about clinical trials. Mild cognitive impairment caregivers said that using iPads in clinical trials could be an incentive, and we've done that a few times. The caregivers thought about keeping video logs rather than paper logs could be fun for patients. And particularly the MCI patients really did pretty well with this. Digital trackers and tests could be, intuitive, stimulating, and delightful to use. And if we make the direction simple, without being condescending, obviously, this could be a wonderful, wonderful tool. Another thing with mild Alzheimer's disease patients, they don't just necessarily acknowledge that they have the disease. And this could affect enrollment. Mild AD patients, they accept their symptoms, but not their diagnosis. Oftentimes you'll hear them say, oh, it's normal memory loss, it's just a part of getting older. So normalizing this memory loss and the cognitive deficits and framing them as a natural part of aging is very important. And we found that informed consent and any other patient-facing information is sensitive to that and, talking more about the symptoms rather than giving them that diagnosis. So, the easier and the more friendly language we use for these folks, the better it would be. And so we've seen varying stages require a slightly different approach. Mild cognitive impairment patients are more involved in their decision-making, and they can carry a bit more of the research requirement burden. The Alzheimer's disease community is large and very engaged. As a matter of fact, I just participated in an Alzheimer's disease walk this past weekend, and I know there are hundreds more around the country this month. So engaging with Alzheimer's disease associations and local chapters is a great way to spread the word about clinical research. And from my past experience, we've had a lot of success reaching audiences also online with targeted social and paid ads, as well as radio and print. So there are different ways of engaging this community, and definitely digital is the way to go, particularly when the caregivers are becoming much more involved and they're looking online. So in the past, we've developed websites that folks, most often caregivers, were diverted to find out about the studies and to see if their loved one might qualify. Engaging the medical community with education by actively reaching out, as more and more GPs are seeing prodromal AD because of the comorbidities. They don't want to lose their patients. So perhaps we can make them sub-Is on the study. Can we bring physical exams and psychometric tests to the sites? And of course, how do we keep the patient and their caregiver engaged and compliant? We need to be flexible in appointment times, as caregivers often have many responsibilities. Designing a quiet place to do assessments, providing constant positive feedback, giving the patient a sense of accomplishment. That's really important. And of course, appointment reminder cards and transportation assistance is very, very important to provide for clinical studies. And, also in-home nursing. Can we move any assessments out of the site and into the patient's home? So transportation reimbursement, perhaps free parking, stipends for lunch, study compensation. Those are all very good incentives for keeping patients engaged. And so what are some of our recommendations? My colleague Jeff Zucker and I had a discussion last week about this, and really educating caregivers and educating GPs and the community is so important. So for caregivers, letting them know that there's no cure right now. And so clinical trials really can offer hope. And having that message out there is super important. Educating GPs, making them a sub-I. As I mentioned earlier, they are seeing more of these patients. And so some of the more granular recommendations would be, for example, spreading an 8-hour visit over 2 days, scheduling more severe, sick patients earlier in the day. As I mentioned earlier, giving iPads to patients throughout the day, make it personalized, stimulating, entertaining. Even considering giving an iPad as reimbursement for the study, that's worked before. Because of their changing needs, sensitivity to sensation, they're often unfamiliar with surroundings. Comfort is paramount with these folks. And as I mentioned earlier, conducting in-home treatments, if at all possible, is also very helpful. Mild AD folks may withdraw from social life. They may be lonely. They may need some stimulation. Caregivers are burdened, alone, frustrated, and they can no longer matter in the relationship. So caregivers need some relief, and we must find ways to administer, sensitivity training to the sites, really, for the caregivers as well as the patients. So administering cognitive tests with empathy and encouragement. Consider holding on-site support groups for caregivers, setting up a social room where patients can interact and their caregivers can meet other caregivers. That's huge to have that support. Personalizing interactions as much as possible. Skype is really good, and many mild cognitive impaired folks use Skype. Send and call patients with reminders. Consider providing vouchers, as I said earlier, for lunch or for parking. Offer counseling at sites. Mild AD patients are very frightened of lumbar punctures. So how do we deal with that? Train study staff to calmly explain MRIs, infusions, lumbar punctures, and set expectations about what they might feel like. Have phlebotomists and geriatrics experience doing needle sticks, so that would be really helpful if the site staff had that. Train the nurses and phlebotomists and those doing the lumbar punctures in principles of clear communication with people who have Alzheimer's disease. Caregivers say that one important thing that can help patients handle long clinic visits is personalized TV and or movies. So train the staff at the sites to be not only calm and supportive, but perhaps, give them the iPads to increase familiarity and keep them entertained, and allow patients maybe access to Netflix or data or games and stimulation. Building simplified instructions and guides to using these iPads is also very important. And then finally, in materials, the messaging designed for patients describe the symptoms without naming them. Reframe cognitive tests as meant to be difficult. Keep explanations short and simple. Use pictures and icons in materials. And all of the folks treating these people should speak slowly and clearly, maintaining eye contact and facing the patient, and making it clear that the study is meant to preserve quality of life. And I'll just end my talk here with a few of the creatives that we have done recently for a few studies. And you can see how we've made them colorful and, really reaching out to these folks. So thank you very much for your time. I hope I didn't go over, and I hope we still have some time for Q&A.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Dr. Babich and Jeff. At this time, we'll spend a few minutes answering some questions that have come in. If for some reason we run out of time and we do not get to your question, we will reach out to you individually. Okay, this looks like it's a question for Dr. Babich. What evidence can research sites use to demonstrate that there is a progressive cognitive impairment? It looks like this person listed some examples, which are objective test only, family input, letter from referring clinician to the research site, and they're asking for what other types of evidence.
Well, this is a great question. All of these instruments are fine. The best are definitely will be if we have two neuropsychological tests with a time difference of 3 or 4 months or even longer. But anything what is objective might be helpful. There is no ideal, of course, answer. But when I do not have something something better, I'm using Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which serves me as a pretty good instrument. I know there are some fluctuations in a mini-mental and Montreal scale in a day, or also there are fluctuations regarding some external circumstances, patient's behavior, mood, even weather can insist. But with a more careful examination, which is usually not typical examination, which is usually rather talk to patient, discussing with patient, I have a pretty good impression of progression or not.
Great, thank you. Barbara, this one is for you. You mentioned Skype earlier. This question is related to, using it for the cognitive testing. The question is, regarding reducing the burden of clinic visits, instead of transportation vouchers, etc., can some of the cognitive testing be done via Skype and still be considered a valid assessment?
That's a very good question. Go ahead, Tom. You want to start?
No, go on. Very good question. Yeah.
I was going to say, my mother, a friend of mine who lives here in Wilmington, North Carolina, has a mother who's got Alzheimer's disease, and she's in Paris, and they Skype every single day. So Skype is very good for that. I'm not certain that Skype is the ideal way to be doing cognitive assessments, but correct me if I'm wrong, Tom.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think cognitive assessments, because of the sensitivity, really do best if they can be done in office in a controlled setting with the proper personnel in place. So I think there's just too much room for, for problems if you're doing it via Skype.
Great. Another question, what are the biggest barriers you see to patients not choosing to enroll in AD studies? Does it differ between MCI and AD?
I can take that. Oh, sorry. Okay. I can take that one. I think that really, as I mentioned earlier, the difference between, prodromal and mild cognitive impaired folks, they could do a lot more on their own. So I think reaching out to them as opposed to their caregiver a little bit more and empowering them is the difference here. Once you get into mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, these folks are getting, having problem making decisions, and so it's really more up to the caregivers, and we would reach out to them, and we could reach out to them, with digital media and via advocacy groups and such.
Okay. Another question, what might be the most acceptable regulatory endpoints for a therapy targeted at altering early functional cognitive decline?
At the moment, it seems that both regulatory agencies at the United States and Europe are accepting ADAS-Cog and some global functional tests. I know that ADAS is not sufficiently sensitive, particularly not in the early stage, but at the moment we need basically to discuss with the regulators which instrument will be the best regarding preclinical Alzheimer's disease, which in 2 studies which are ongoing. Some composite batteries are in usage, so maybe if there will be some changes, I'm sure that some authors of these tests will discuss this issue with regulators. At the moment, there is no accepted unique regulatory advised instrument for such a patient.
Thank you. Another question. Have there been any strides in the area of vaccines for AD prevention?
Can you repeat, please, Nis? I didn't hear exactly.
Sure. Have there been any strides in the area of vaccines for Alzheimer's prevention?
Of course, that is interesting. It's a good question. There is interesting data coming from Biogen study at the moment, where basically we've seen that clearance of amyloid plaques is a dose responsive. What we need to see is a clinical effect. But at the moment, Biogen recently published very interesting data, where in fact, practically in majority of patients who are treated with BR37, in fact, have no plaques. No data yet about clinical improvement.
Thank you. Another question from someone's own experience. The question is, patients are unwilling or are afraid to stay overnight for PSG testing in my trial. Do you have experience with this, and is there anything I could do to make them more comfortable?
No, I'm sorry, I do not have experience with overnight stay for testing in patients with Alzheimer's disease. I have this experience in Parkinson's disease, and practically I haven't had any problem with overnight stay for patients in Parkinson's disease. In Alzheimer's disease, I didn't have any study where I needed to have patients overnight stay.
I would add that perhaps if you can have the caregiver nearby, that would certainly make it easier on the patient staying overnight.
Thank you. We probably have time for one or two more questions, and again, if we did not answer your question, we will reach out to you. This question, how much do you see genetic testing coming into play in clinical research?
The problem is always with results. Genetic testing are quite common in Alzheimer's disease research, particularly ApoE genetic testing or genetic tests in patients with a history of siblings with Alzheimer's disease. But the problem is always how to say to patient and his family about genetic results, which is similar problem in Huntington disease as well. At the moment, as far as I know, genetic tests in patients with Alzheimer's disease is limited only on few in commercial clinical trials. I think only on ApoE genotype with no final report to the patients. Also, there are some genetic tests in non-commercial clinical trials which I'm not familiar with.
Perfect, thank you. We have about a minute left, so I am going to wrap up. I would like to thank our speakers, and I would like to thank all of you for joining our webinar today. As a reminder, all attendees will receive a link to view the recording, so be expecting an email from us, most likely tomorrow. We also, like I said, will reach out to any person who asked a question that we did not get to answer. For more information about Worldwide Clinical Trials, we invite you to visit worldwide.com, and we hope you enjoyed our webinar today and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.